My dad's stated goal was to become a millionaire by the time he was 30. But in his 20s, God really gripped his heart and he became a pastor instead. As a teenager, I looked at that and said, my dad has failed. So I decided to make it my goal. I vowed that I would become a millionaire by the time I was 30. When I was in high school, I wanted the same thing that all boys want: sex, fame, money. I went to a self-paced high school, which means I didn't really have to go to class, and so I got my real estate license. I actually graduated from college before high school. I became what is likely the youngest realtor in the nation, and I bought a fourplex and flipped it. I bought 2 cars, I traveled a lot. I made a lot of money, and I blew it all. I met Michelle when we were 12 years old, and we got married in our early 20s. We had 300 people at our wedding, and we took off on Sea-Doos instead of a car. It was a great time. We traveled to Central America. I'd always wanted to see Lake Nicaragua. It's considered one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It's one of the few places on earth that has freshwater sharks. We went down to the lake on this blazing hot day. There were plastic bottles on the water for as far as the eye could see. We were so disappointed. As we walked back to the bus stop, we noticed this young man with no legs, and he was walking on crutches, and he sat down beside a rusty, leaking fire hydrant, and he pulled out a straw. He started drinking from it. Michelle and I ran into a local convenience store, and we bought plastic bottles of orange juice and water. We sat with this boy. His name was Daniel. He was 19 years old, and he had no hope. Daniel rocked me. I had never seen poverty before. I had never witnessed environmental degradation before, and it changed me. In that moment, I knew that I needed to learn how to steward money so that people like Daniel wouldn't have to drink from rusty fire hydrants. And my dream of becoming a millionaire just died. There came a point where I couldn't just say what I believed. I had to live my convictions. And I had to develop the skills to live out my new calling. Things like having a schedule, having a budget, figuring out how to use my time and money in a way that actually helped instead of hurt. I was at a conference in Chicago in my early 20s, and there was this British businessman speaking, and he was talking about strengths. And he said, a strength is not something that you're really good at. A strength is something that you're good at, but it strengthens you. It makes you stronger. What is your strength? And I immediately knew I love telling stories. I love to write. By the end of that afternoon, I knew what I was supposed to do with my life. I want to tell stories that lead people closer to Jesus, and I want to give away the profits. That's it. So I've got this grand vision for my life now, but I have no way to execute on it. So I flew to Vancouver Island and I did an internship with one of my favorite authors. And while we were out there, I applied for over 60 jobs, and I just couldn't find work. So we came back home, and I applied for more jobs, and I still couldn't find work. And things were desperate. I applied to the government for this grant for people who just can't find a job. And it was for $7,000, and it was a bursary to go back to school. And I started to train to become a trucker. I figured I like driving, gives me lots of time to think and write. I'll just drive until something breaks. Michelle and I really mourned the fact that I was going to be gone 6 days a week for the foreseeable future. But just a few weeks before I was going to start that job, I got a literary agent and a book deal. And I dodged a bullet. But I'm so glad I went through that, because now I can empathize with people who can't find work, for people whose money is so tight. I feel it. There's this notion that overnight success just happens, but the reality is it's more like overnight success in a decade or less. It was a full 10 years from the time I decided I wanted to be an author to when my first book hit the shelves. It's not an easy process. It's joyous, I love what I do, but it's not easy. Michelle and I have some friends who are fairly well off, and one night we were driving home from their house. Michelle started comparing everything they had to everything we had, and I said, "Hon, if you think we're the kind of family that's gonna just keep up with the Joneses, you've married the wrong guy. We're gonna increase our standard of giving, not our standard of living." She broke down and said, "Character growth is just so hard. You're always gonna be chasing if you're just going after money. But if you're going after meaning, it's a whole other ballgame, and it's a game worth playing." Most people live paycheck to paycheck. If there's an emergency, they're toast. Their time is booked to the max. There is no time for rest, there's no time for Sabbath, there's no time for reflection. When we don't have time for contemplation, it will lead to exploitation. If we don't give ourselves time to think, we will hurt others. We will decide to buy the cheapest item at the store that's made in a Bangladesh factory. We will click onto that porn site because we've had a long day and we just need an outlet. If we live our lives without margin, we miss a life of meaning. For me, margin is about having the space to say yes. It's about being able to invest both time and money in something that I feel could advance the kingdom. And I can't do that if I'm running to the hilt 24/7. If God calls us to a mission and we're so busy and we're so up to our eyeballs in debt that we can't respond, we could miss out on a huge call that God has for our lives. Having margin has allowed me to do some truly ridiculous things. I got to write a book where I traveled 37,000 miles around the world. I got to hang out with monks and rabbis and walk across a bed of hot coals and go to North Korea and meet the Pope. I got to learn about prayer all over the world, and then I got to share that with tens of thousands of people. That was a joy and a pleasure that I never would have got to experience if I was working a 9-to-5, grinding it out so I could pay for a huge house and a nice car. Basically, I had to make a decision of, was I gonna build God's kingdom or my empire? One might feel like a sacrifice, but the other was worth so much more. Michelle and I went to a conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and we saw a film on human trafficking, and it rocked us. We came home and we said we'd do something about it. So we started doing coffee shops and art shows and concerts just to tell people what was going on in the world and how they could help. So we started making documentaries. We made one on human trafficking. We made one on prostitution globally. We made another one on pornography addiction among young people. And one of our most recent projects is a documentary on slavery. We've gotten to make movies and write books that are leading the world closer to Jesus. We've gotten to travel all over the world and meet incredible people doing amazing work. So since then, we've basically been saying, are we going to increase our standard of living or are we going to increase our standard of giving? So we capped our lifestyle. It was inspired by John Wesley. He made the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in today's money, but he lived on 7% less than the average Londoner at the time. So every year we just go on StatsCan and we see how much the average Canadian makes, and that's what we cap our income at. Anything above that, giving fund. It's not ours. We want to live like normal people and we want to give like extraordinary people. I want to be like John Wesley when I grow up. I remember the first time that we got to cut a $1,000 giving check. We had been living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, dollar to dollar, and then for the first time we get to add 3 zeros on a check and then give it away. There's nothing like that. I'll never forget that day. When we were in Central America, we stayed for a month in this riverside casita and there was nothing to do. And I read 10 books that month, and There was a line in one of the books that said something like, for the cost of a year's tuition, a young man can furnish himself a house for a lifetime. And I thought, how could I do that today? And then I realized I could buy a trailer. If I could swallow my pride and ego, I could live in a tiny home. So that's what we did. We've spent the last 4 years living in a trailer, and it's given us a margin of time and money so that we can work on projects that we feel God has called us to. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, he builds this palace, Versailles, hundreds of rooms. He doesn't even have running water. He's the richest man in the world, and we have more food selection at our local convenience store, let alone grocery store, than he ever had in his lifetime. We are materially, statistically richer than kings, and yet it's never enough. Every day, I've got to put myself back on the altar. I've got to hand over my money and my time. I've got to hand over my desire to live for me. I've got to kill it. We don't have a lot of the stuff that a lot of our friends have. We have shorter ceilings, we have skinnier walls, but it doesn't matter. It does not even matter. We're trying to live on a longer timeline. It's just something I wish I had figured out 10 years earlier. After high school, me and 3 friends drove coast to coast across the country, and on my way back, I was somewhere in Montana, and I stopped at this store on a First Nations native reserve, and I somehow ended up in the jewelry section, and there was all these cheesy rings, and there was this one beautiful, simple, sterling silver ring, and I bought it. About a year later, the ring broke, and I kept wearing it. I didn't know why. I just felt like I was supposed to have it. Recently, I learned about this concept called memento mori. Ancient monks used to look at their hands, and if you look at your hand, there's kind of an M carved into each palm, and they used to say, memento mori, remember you must die. God has carved it on our hands. It never occurred to me when I was a teenager that I was going to die someday. But then I learned that monks and ancient philosophers used to have all sorts of different memento mori signs. They had skulls and ravens and hourglasses and snails and candles, and sometimes they would have a ring, a way to remind themselves that life is short, so live well. And I realized that my ring is my memento mori. It's my reminder that life is short. The circle is broken. Life ends. Live for eternity, knowing that it's quickly coming to a close. And it comes back to my favorite verse. Teach us to number our days that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Help us to learn to live well, because life is short. My dream for my friends, for my family, for everyone that I meet, is that they will enter the fullness of their calling, that they will become everything they were created to be, and that they would do everything that they were created to do. That's my dream for everyone I ever come in contact with. A world full of people living their calling, that is heaven on earth. God, how then shall we live? What should we do with the time we've been given? Teach us to number our days. Give us a heart of wisdom. That's my thing. I'm Jared Brock, and you're watching This Is Me TV. Right in the middle of the bottom, there's a guy in a red plaid shirt, and he's kind of sitting like a cowboy. Well, he actually is a cowboy. There is a strain of Hasidic Judaism that dresses up like cowboys. They wear cowboy hats and boots and plaid shirts because that's actually considered kosher. So I don't know about you, but if I ever switch religions, I'm becoming a kosher cowboy.